To this next lesson, and we're going to begin this one looking at the Pauline Studies. And by doing so, we are going to just talk about just about Paul today in this lesson. Paul and his letters and his life, different ways of looking at who Paul is. And so let's just really begin making sure that you have your notes, making sure that you have all the information that you need. Talking about Paul's early life, according to Acts 22, verses 1 through 21, obviously we know that Paul is a Jew. Philippians even tells us that. There's a great description that we'll talk about in just a second out of Philippians chapter 3. He is from Tarsus, so sometimes we call him Saul of Tarsus or Paul of Tarsus. He was educated under Gamaliel. Education back in Paul's days, you really attached yourself to one person and you learned from them. And to learn from Gamaliel was to learn from the best. And he was an agent of the Sanhedrin, which he did the Sanhedrin's work. When the persecution began in the early book of Acts, he was the one that said, hey, give me the stuff, I'll go and get them. Acts chapter 26, we learn that Paul was raised in Jerusalem, and obviously learning from Gamaliel. He was a strict Pharisee, and he persecuted part of the Sanhedrin. And being a strict Pharisee, that means that he followed the rules of the Pharisees. We learn from like the Gospels about Paul and other Pharisees, where they did not like Jesus going outside of what they had said. And then a passage out of Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 through 6, that his parents were practicing Jews. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, which was, again, the best tribe to be from. And he was zealous for the law, which means that he was one who wanted to keep the law the way that it is. There's Paul's selfie, his portrait. I guess it's not a selfie if he's not taking it. But there he is. Somebody maybe got a picture of him with their iPhone, uploaded it to Facebook back in Paul's day. We know from Acts chapter 7 that they cast him out of the city and they stoned him. This is talking about Stephen, that they stoned Stephen, and the witnesses laid down his clothes, talking about Stephen's clothes, at the feet of the young man named Saul. And then we learn then from chapter 8 that the great persecution began, and Paul was really the one that was driving that. And he said, let me go up to Damascus and let me go after the ones that are fleeing and bring them back. So Paul's on his way to Damascus. A bright light shines around, and hears the voice of God, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And from Acts chapter 9, and later he is chosen to be an instrument. God can use anybody at any time to do anything, according to Acts chapter 9, verse 15 through 16. Now, a lot of times we read the book of Acts and we think, okay, Paul is converted. A few chapters later, he leaves to go on his missionary journey. That time period actually covers several years. And so we have the re-educating of Paul. He stays in Damascus for just a little bit. And then we learn from Galatians, the book of Galatians, that he departs for the Arabian kingdom, which would have been more east of Jerusalem, going into either Iraq or could have been northern Saudi Arabia, somewhere in that region. And then according to Acts chapter 9, then he returns to Damascus, and his ministry was cut short by the governor at that time, And so his first post-conversion visit to Jerusalem, Barnabas encourages the other disciples, because imagine this: I'm a disciple. Forget about all that Paul's done, and all of a sudden he shows up and says, "Hey, I'm one of you guys. I'm a Christian." There's probably a lot of skepticism, but Barnabas says really he encourages. He spent about 15 days getting to know Peter and James, and then he flees to Tarsus because obviously when you worked for the Sanhedrin and you were persecuting, now you're part of the group that you were persecuting, so people are going to be upset with you. So he goes, flees to his hometown of Tarsus, and he stays there for a while. I have a decade or so, until Barnabas calls him to Antioch. And then he goes from Jerusalem to Antioch, and he goes with Paul. Paul goes with Barnabas to Jerusalem, according to Acts chapter 11. And then while he's in Antioch, that's when Paul's journey begins. And so when this video is over, there'll be another video that talks about Paul's missionary journeys that you'll need to watch in order to begin your project. And this information that I'm going to give you is information that I've given before, but it bears repeating. There's a map of Paul's first missionary journey. And this is the same information I gave you earlier. It takes about 18 months. He goes around through this Mediterranean region right here, up through, this is called the Galatia region. Remember, this whole peninsula-looking area is what is now modern-day Turkey. This is what's called Asia Minor, but it's now modern-day Turkey up in here. This is Greece, Macedonia over here. Rome would be just off the side over here. His second missionary journey, a little bit longer, takes about 3 years. He goes all the way back up and around. And I'm going to pause for a second, and I might throw out a question. I know you'll answer to yourself. Hopefully you get it right. But Paul's first, second, and third missionary journeys all start from the same city. What city is that? Hopefully you said to yourself, it is the city of Antioch. His third missionary journey starting where? In Antioch, right here, is his longest. Takes about 4 years. Goes almost 3,000 miles. Goes back through a lot of the same area that he's been at before. But remember, when he returns from his third missionary journey, he's arrested in Jerusalem. And he spends some time there, but when he finally is taken to Rome, he leaves Jerusalem, kind of goes up and around along the coast. Remember, during this time, it was safer to sail along the coast, and you can get in and out of the little ports. But then on the way, he has a shipwreck in Malta, goes up, and finally ends at Rome. Remember, that's kind of where that's where Acts stops. We don't know what happens. But thank goodness that we kind of have an idea from some other books of what goes on. So we talk about the captivity period. So he's arrested in Jerusalem around AD 57. He is imprisoned in Caesarea, which is just outside of Jerusalem. Then he journeys to Rome. He's in house arrest in Rome, and that's where some of the books that we'll talk about, like Ephesians, Paul being what we call his prison epistles, is this time when he's in house arrest in Rome. And people were able to come and go. It's kind of more like staying in a little cottage, and people were allowed to come. And then probably sometime around 62, he's released. Now, none of this, starting with the release, is covered in the book of Acts. He arrives in Rome, and that's it. That's all we know. We know he spent some time there, and then he was released. Later, we're going to learn things that aren't covered by Acts, but are covered by other letters. There is about a 3-year period we call the silent years. He may have journeyed to Spain, which was his desire, but I kind of doubt that. If that was Paul's goal, which he had talked about in the book of Romans, then I believe he probably would have mentioned that in some of his later writings. He does go in and around the Aegean Sea, which is up there between Turkey and the Greece in that area. He may have been captured, probably maybe in Troas, which is northern modern-day Turkey, around 66 to 67. And then sometime around AD 67, he is executed, most likely in Rome. Now, we learn that from some of the other books, especially his later books like Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy. When we talk about Paul's letters, the way that they are in the books is not necessarily the order that they are written in. I remember our discussion is, although Mark was written first, Matthew is first, most likely because of the genealogy and the birth of Christ. But the order is more logical than chronological. Paul's books are based on epistle to churches and places first, and then letters to individuals are second. And then within those groups, it's moving from longer to shorter. So Romans being the longest of Paul's books, and then 1 Corinthians, and then 2 Corinthians. Then we move all the way through, ending with 2 Thessalonians, and then we move into the letters to people, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Now, when we look at the books, we are going to look at them in the order in which they were written. Now, the textbook that you are currently reading, there will be a lot of discrepancy between some of the things that the author of your textbook and I disagree on. And so I want you to be aware of that. So what you read in your textbook and what you see in your lecture videos is going to be quite different. Remember, your reading quizzes will be based on your textbook. Questions for your exams come from your lecture videos. The author of your textbook does have a right to be wrong, and in some of these cases, I think he surely is. Now, Paul's letters are a lot different than other letters. A lot of times in this time, a private letter averaged around 90 words. A lot of that could be education, buying the paper to write on, get it out in the shortest amount of time. Literary letters were a little bit longer. These would be, a literary letter would be something like somebody writing a poem or a story, something to that fact would be somewhere around 200 words. Paul's letters were longer and averaged, if you take all of his letters together, averaged around 1,300 words. So almost 6.5 times as long as a literary letter, and almost 13 times as long as just a private letter. Even those private letters to some of the individuals were longer. Paul's letters were really theological in content and had specific addresses. They were directed to, except for really, I think maybe just one letter. There'd be Romans, Galatians. Sorry, I said the wrong one. The letter to Galatians is not specifically addressed. It's more to a general area. But they all were in different areas. Now, some of Paul's letters use what is called an amanuensis. An amanuensis is really a big old fancy word for a secretary. Paul used some in several occasions, 1 Corinthians being one, most likely Galatians, Colossians. But Paul had, and as you'll read in a paper posted to Blackboard, Paul may have had an eye disorder. That comes from closing of one of his letters. He says, "See how I've written you in such big handwriting." He may have had an eye disorder. And the use of an amanuensis is not something that would have been uncommon in the time, but does bring up some discussion for some people. And what the amanuensis really did. And there's several ways to look at that. Reason that evidence that he did is sometimes there's incomplete sentences. There would be some stylistic differences, frequent closing, or he says, "Hey, see, I've written you in my own hand." Romans actually closes with one that says, "This is Tertius writing to you." The incomplete sentences could be that Paul maybe have dictated too fast and they couldn't keep up. Could be that Paul had a rough outline and then permitted the amanuensis to use his own vocabulary. And so the use of an amanuensis is basically because, I think because of Paul's eye disorder. It really doesn't take it away from Paul being the author. Again, he could have dictated to it, and they just copied it down. I don't think that takes away from Paul being the author. Again, it was a very common practice in that time. Paul's letters basically follow a basic outline. The greeting, which he identifies the sender and the recipient. Usually there is a prayer concerned for the welfare of those. And then the main body would discuss a theological or issues to be discussed. Or in case of 1 Corinthians, he answers questions that the church had for him. And then the closing, again, he greets people. He may say, "Hey, come join me. Tell this person hello." And if you go through Paul's letters, you can really see in a lot of them, especially the letters to the churches, that they pretty much follow a standard greeting. "I, Paul," or "I, Paul and Silas," or "I, Paul and so greet you." And then in closing again, "Hey, say hello to so-and-so. Thanks so-and-so for this. I like so-and-so. Tell them I said hello." And so those kind of greetings go out throughout all of Paul's letters. And so, again, make sure when you finish this video, there will be a video for you to watch on Paul's Missionary Journeys project that will help you get started on that. And as always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to let me know.